Hey everyone, I ran out of things to talk about, so now I only have one thing left for me to do. Bitch about some pixels!
The Nintendo Entertainment System, bringing you less pixels before less pixels were cool. A console destined to fail, but managing to survive, bringing a company from playing cards and easy-to-make toys to the video game market.
This little gray toaster managed to bring back the entirety of the video game industry after the Atari fiasco. And sure, maybe its graphics are a little less Super Mario and more dots and boxes, but hey, charm is in simplicity, am I right?
But before we start with this hopeful resurrection of gaming, we must first visit the downfall of gaming. Upon gaming being first introduced everywhere, every single company was immediately shooting their shot to get that free money. Just slap some pixels together, call it Bob, paint a box, make some enemies, and call the game Space Bob, and boom, you have a hit game that a bunch of middle schoolers are going to run and jam as many quarters as they can into the machine. It was an incredibly simple formula given the simplicity of games at the time.
After the success of arcade games and, well, the arcade, everyone wanted to experience video gaming in their own home. It may seem like a second thought now, but there once was a time where you couldn't just walk from your bed to your nearest game console, turn it on, grab a controller, and then play the new video game that's out. Instead, you had to rummage through your couch to find quarters just to shove into some annoying ass machine, so that way you could play for like 3 minutes. Or pray that your mom would be willing to spare 6 quarters so that way you and a couple of friends could head to the arcade at the mall and play Pong. But eventually we got the chance to play arcade games at home. Kinda.
The Magnavox Odyssey, the first video game console available for retail. With some incredibly simple graphics, the system let you play simple games on your TV, which was incredibly innovative at the time. This was huge for the industry. Now people could play video games at home, but it could be better, and that's where Atari comes in.
The Atari 2600, increasing the overall graphics in gaming by introducing colors and squares. Finally, no one was bound to a little white dot moving across the screen under an overlay that you put onto your TV. Instead, we had yellow dot versus his mortal enemy, blue dot. Of course, the novels, manuals, or movies that the games were made off of would flesh out the story a lot more. It'd basically tell you, alright kiddo, see, if the yellow dot hits the blue dot, you die. While some people see this as a reason to use your imagination, I see it as a hallucination.
After the major success of the Atari 2600, many other consoles were released with the new graphics easily available that were on the Atari 2600. One of which was the return of the Magnavox Odyssey, and the Magnavox Odyssey Squared.
It looks like it got overtaken by 3rd grade math.
33 major console releases, including Atari's first true rival with the Intellivision, Game & Watch systems, the Commodore, the first Game TV, the ColecoVision, and the first ever handheld in the Microvision. So many games and consoles were released, especially for the Atari 2600. They all began blending together and were so basic and simple. Consumers got overwhelmed and confused, and simply just stopped buying games or consoles. This was known as the video game crash of 1983, or the Atari crash.
Gaming was at an all-time low. No one was buying games and the market was way too overstimulated. But one company known for their game cards and small handheld consoles known as the Game & Watch systems was about to introduce a console that would revolutionize gaming and revive the gaming market with the release of their first ever home console system.
Released in 1985 in North America, the Nintendo Entertainment System single-handedly revived a dying industry. Oh my god, Nintendo, you did it. This toaster looks amazing. Imagine how many pieces of toast I can make. Jokes aside, the NES was huge in the market. So many classic games have been released, and it had been released 3 years after the Atari, which was long after the video game crash and the controllers turning into remotes before that was even popular. The NES was an absolutely huge success, but not without its faults.
After the video game crash, retailers were very hesitant on putting out more video games onto their shelves. worried they might not sell due to market and consumer fatigue. So Nintendo did what they do best. They made a toy!
Rob, or the robotic operating buddy, was made to ease retailers' fears of the console. Nintendo introduced Rob as a way to market the NES less to a video game console and more as a toy that just so happened to play video games. Unfortunately, despite the uniqueness of Rob, only 2 games were made for him before he was phased out and NES sales climbed. But Nintendo had a new idea: giving kids guns.
The NES Zapper, a light gun originally made for Duck Hunt. While the original color was gray, Nintendo opted to change the color to the iconic orange after toy gun laws were revised. As a kid, I would have absolutely loved this. Unfortunately, I was too busy not being alive. But believe me, I would have loved to shoot some virtual ducks. Those fuckers know what they did.
And then there were the games, a great lineup no doubt. Metroid, Mario, Kid Icarus, Zelda, Zelda 2, Tetris, Excitebike, Contra, Mega Man, Kirby, Dr. Mario, and Battletoads, as well as so many more. But the issue was with the cartridge. See, after using the cartridge so many times, the internal connectors began to become damaged and weren't able to connect the data between the NES and the game. So the obvious answer was to blow in them. Just imagine this: your child dies, the first thing you do is start blowing on them. That came out wrong, but you know what I mean.
See, in the NES, you'd think that it would stand for Nintendo Entertainment System. I, however, choose the name Nintendo Exercise System, like a prehistoric version of Wii Fit, but instead of doing yoga, you're instead performing the tilt and blow into the cartridges. Just imagine the ad campaign: Nintendo, bringing you closer to your TV than ever before. Because you have to keep removing the cartridge and blowing it.
Of course, I'd hate myself if I didn't mention the biggest failure of them all for the NES: the Power Glove. Where do I even start with this? Let's start with the movie. Yeah, there was a movie. The Wizard. Released in 1989, a film purely made to advertise the NES and the brand new Power Glove. But what was the Power Glove? Well, it was Nintendo's first try at motion controls. There were a few bars that you could connect to your TV that would track the Power Glove. On the glove, there were buttons that allowed you to control other aspects of the game you couldn't do with just motion controls. Honestly, this was so fucking cool. But sadly, the tech wasn't all there yet. But you can't blame Nintendo for trying. This was awesome, and I'd love to see it again someday.
Overall, the NES was amazing, bringing back the video game industry as well as introducing new gaming ideas. But the NES still had one thing left in store: a remaster of the original console.
The new style NES. After everyone complained about how much the controllers hurt their hand with the sharp corners and the easily worn down connectors, Nintendo re-released the console with a new top loader design, where you could place the game from the top rather than putting it inside the system itself, like with the original NES. The connectors were far better and would last just a bit longer than the NES. Also, the controller was renewed, dubbed the Dogbone controller. The controller looked like, well, a dog bone, with rounded grips on the side, allowing for more comfortable playing experiences. Nintendo had done something very few had done. They made their console better.
Crazy how far Nintendo went in such a short amount of time. Making a movie to advertise their console, trying to integrate motion controls into the gaming market, and even making games that still hold up today, like Super Mario Bros. Or The Legend of Zelda. Nintendo, you are amazing, but oh my fucking god, did you mess up a lot later. Hey everyone! After the grand success of the NES, Nintendo only had one thing left to do: fuck it all up!
After the release of the NES, one new gaming console was rising in the market and had become a major competitor to Nintendo.
Sega! Holy shit, that scares me every single time. Nintendo had a large control over the gaming market, and with the gaming market still evolving, the NES was slowly becoming more and more outdated. Gone were the days of shooting ducks. Instead, we had 16 bits and a certain blue hedgehog.
The Sega Genesis, Nintendo's worst nightmare. Whereas Nintendo had to fight against the market fatigue from the video game crash of 1983, Sega had a free pass all the way through. It was 1989, 4 years after the release of the NES, which was becoming more and more outdated. New tech was being introduced for video games, allowing for more advanced games to be made, and Sega was about to make their most advanced game of all time, Sonic the Hedgehog Arnold Palmer Tournament Golf. Yup.
Contrary to popular belief, Sonic the Hedgehog was not the first game released on the Sega Genesis. Instead, it was Arnold Palmer's Tournament Golf. The Genesis wasn't doing too well for its first couple of years, and there wasn't really a reason for it. It was just another game console. That was until 1991.
Sonic the Hedgehog, the certified cool guy of the 90s. The Sega Genesis was marketed to kids who played the NES who were now older and wanted something more adult. They didn't want the Mario machine, Mom. They wanted the fast mouse console. The Sega Genesis wasn't your grandpa's console. In June 1991, the Sega Genesis sales rose like crazy, and it was about time for Nintendo to make a comeback.
See, after the NES, Nintendo didn't just leave the gaming scene. They stuck around and took the idea from their old Game & Watch systems and transformed it into a new modern design of the Game Boy. Nintendo had full control over their handheld market of gaming, but they wanted their old position of being top of the home console market again. They had already been working on a new console, but on August 23rd, 1991, the world was going to see Nintendo's home console resurrection.
The Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Holy shit, it has shoulders now.
Football players have some competition.
Nintendo listened to the criticism of the NES and they made the SNES, a top loader which was a major feature of the remastered NES, allowing for connectors between cartridge and console that last far longer than ever before. The console itself looks so much better. It wasn't a cinder block anymore, it was a cinder block with a... Oh god, censor that.
Sadly, the SNES wasn't doing too well at the start. Nintendo hardly did as much marketing as they did with the NES compared to the SNES. Plus, there wasn't much for casual consumers to differentiate between the classic NES and the brand new SNES. People just saw it as, oh, it's a new NES. We already have one of those. Ironically, Nintendo never learned from this mistake, with later on the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance, the Wii to Wii U, and of course, the DS to 2 and 3DS.
Marketing aside, Nintendo and Sega had some serious beef with one another, fighting over consumers and having the greatest console war of all time, with Sega saying that they do what Nintendo don't. Nintendo was a classic brand while Sega was a newcomer, but Sega's larger catalog of games prior to the SNES's release made it a far better choice. It was the difference between walking through an aisle of video games and seeing so many copies of Genesis games, and only a few new SNES games. Sure, you could go pick up the SNES games and be unique, but you'd be missing out on the cool blue rabbit.
SNES sales dwindled. Nintendo simply took too long to release their new home console, and Sega had the last laugh. Sega took over, and there was nothing Nintendo could do. Nintendo just lost. Until Donkey Kong Country release. Fuck yeah!
Holy shit! 2D, 3D. Mom, get the camera. It has more than 2 animation frames. You can see its ass.
I'll always remember the day I saw Donkey Kong's ass.
This game was massive. See, what Nintendo had done was make 3D models of Donkey Kong and his other enemies alongside Diddy Kong. Then, they simply made 2D renders of all the sides of the 3D renders to make the game look more 3D. Sega had no comeback. Their blue whale was stuck being 2D, not a 3D model in a 2D game. The SNES ultimately pulled ahead of the Genesis and began quickly outselling. Not to mention, the Genesis was becoming over-commercialized. Too many games were being made and sold. Not to mention, some actually began preferring the slowness of Mario and DK. You got to admire the game more and effort rather than quickly speeding through an entire level. The SNES had done it Nintendo was back on top.
Gone were the days of the fucking blue dog and his a companion with two tails named Bob. Now we had Donkey motherfucking Kong. But Nintendo just kept pushing boundaries. In 1993, a year before the release of Donkey Kong Country, Nintendo also released Star Fox, another 3D game set in a 2D bound system. It was amazing, but a new age was upon us. 32 bits were now being used by Sega and were being more readily developed for other consoles. But technology was finally advanced enough to make true 3D games. Imagine what 3 whole axes of movement could do. What would that even look like?
What the fuck?
What the fuck? Hey everyone, you know what's better than sex? That's right, house arrest.
House arrest is the best thing to happen ever since the age of home consoles, circa 1981. Now, house arrest is a modern commodity. Everyone wants house arrest. There's 2D house arrest, 3D house arrest, VR house arrest.
Shit, I sound like that? I probably got my scripts mixed up. That script was for the introduction of 3D video games, which I guess I got mixed up with my script for house arrest. But seeing that I'm on house arrest, there's only one thing better that I can do. Not talk about house arrest, and instead talk about 3D gaming, which is the same thing.
The Magnavox Odyssey was the first to bring video games home to everyone. The Atari gave games color and more advanced graphics. The Nintendo Entertainment System brought gaming back from its near-death experience. The Game Boy revolutionized games by making them handheld on a decently small device. The Sega Genesis gave older kids something new to try with better graphics, and the SNES began displaying 3D games in 2D environments. Now, where do we go from here?
Hell.
32 bits. It's the next big thing. Sega had already made the switch with a tumor on the Sega Genesis, but Nintendo didn't really care for 32 bits. They wanted to go straight to 3D and 64 bits. After they had already made a deal with the tech company Sony to help with the creation of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, Nintendo began working with Sony to create the next console. By this point, cartridges were old news. You couldn't hold as much data on them, so companies began pivoting to a disc system, using CDs to hold more memory. The first ever of these consoles to do this was the Philips CDI system, allowing you to use CDs functionally to play games, watch videos, listen to music, and so much more.
Yeah, I went to shit shortly after. No one used the CDI. Everyone already had things that already did all the things that the Philips CDI could do. There was no purpose in buying it. Most people had gaming consoles, most people had TV and cable, and majority of people already had plenty of things that could play music, ranging from stereos to just DVD players. Hell, even cable had a few channels that would just play regular music. There was no purpose to the CDI. But one thing good did come of the CDI. That was the horrible Nintendo licensed games that came out for it. That, and it introduced CD gaming into the gaming market.
CDs were able to hold so much more information that they became the standard in gaming. Every console was converting entirely to CD disc drives, including Atari, who is still somehow active in the home console markets with the Atari Jaguar CD. And then in 1994, Sega released the first major retail console using a CD drive, the Sega Saturn, a fully 3D 32-bit successor to the Sega Genesis. Oh my god. How did this fail?
In 1994, Japan was huge into the fighting video game market. Everyone was playing fighting games. Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, Tekken. That's all the ones that I can think of. And when the Saturn released in Japan, it became the first time that many Japanese households got the chance to play 3D fighting games at home. Japan became Sega's biggest market when it came to the Sega Saturn. However, a lot of that didn't carry over to the West. People were eager for a successor to the Sega Genesis in North America and other Western countries, but Sega wanted to build more of a catalog before they actually released their console into North American retailers. But a new competitor was already selling out store shelves so quickly that Sega had to completely pivot their original plan. They needed to release the Sega Saturn as soon as possible to maintain their relevance in the market. But many retailers just didn't have the space for the Sega Saturn because it was so sudden that it would be releasing. And many were already having their shelves full of the console that was selling out so quickly. But for those who did sell it, they have to sell a $400 console, whereas their competitor, the mystery console, was $100 cheaper at just under $300. But who was this mystery competitor with their highly well-selling console?
The PlayStation was made by Sony. It was the beginning of a grand end to Sega. After a deal with Nintendo to make a CD 32-bit add-on to the SNES and a fully 3D console failed, Sony repurposed all of their research and patents to a new console, their own console, one that would rival Sega and, more importantly, Nintendo.
Crazy to think that the PlayStation was made in spite. I wonder what else was made in spite. Bad example, but...
So, Sony released an entirely 3D, 32-bit CD console with the PlayStation. Retailers immediately began selling PlayStations, which sold out so absurdly fast, and game developers started making third-party games for the PlayStation due to its more advanced graphics. Nintendo's now outdated hardware with the SNES and Sega's Sun release with the Sega Saturn made everyone want to just go straight towards PlayStation. But Nintendo's old hardware was about to get a major upgrade with...
I always thought it was made by Colgate.
The Virtual Boy, a virtual reality version of the Game Boy.
That's about all I had going for it, I'll be completely honest.
Due to the failed deal Nintendo had with Sony in developing what was known at the time as the Nintendo Ultra 64, Nintendo decided to throw out their own 32-bit console. Released in Japan on July 21st, 1995, and in North America on August 14th, 1995, it was Nintendo's way of competing with the Sony PlayStation and Sega's disaster. The way it works is it used mirrors and stereoscopic and images, or images taken at slightly different angles, to prove depth to the human eye and create depth. Try it. It works.
Oh shit! Oh god! Oh fuck! It's a mirror!
It sucked and sold absolutely horribly. Everyone already had their sights on the PlayStation with its, say it with me now,
fully 3D graphics.
And no one wanted a neck-degrading red headache. The console bombed, with only 22 games being released, and its discontinuation happening 5 months after it released in Japan on December 22nd, 1995, and a year later on North America on August 1996. Though, I choose to believe Nintendo discontinued it far before retailers kept selling it, hoping it would blow up.
So that was it. Sony won with their first ever console. Sega was slowly dying off because of a poor release, and Nintendo just hasn't come back at the time. That was it. Sony won. And there was nothing Nintendo could do about that.
The Nintendo 64.
The Renaissance is back, bitches!
Nintendo was back in full swing. The Nintendo Ultra 64 was now out with a shortened name of the Nintendo 64, or simply N64. Released in North America on September 29th, 1996, this console was the first ever major 64-bit console, giving it its name, the Nintendo 64, or simply N64.
It's like naming your dog Dog. Sure, you're clever, but you sound like a toddler.
And then the majority of games made specifically for it had 64 at the end. Mario 64, Star Fox 64, not fucking Castlevania for some fucking reason, even Zelda 64. Though it was a beta name and it's now known as the Second Coming of God, also known as The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time.
Now, you're probably wondering why I say that. Simple. Have you seen Metacritic? That shit's a 99 out of 100! Second place only going to Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, or as my family likes to call it, Nirvana.
Anyway, back to war. World War II is old news now, Grandpa. In 1996, everyone was gearing up for the grand battle between the PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. Two fully 3D game consoles with huge titles on either side. Both had beaten Sega to a pulp in the past. Now it was time to see who would end up on top. Who will have the best games and the best console? Who will...
It was Sony. The PlayStation already had a head start in the console by about 2 years. Nintendo just took a little bit too long to release their new console. Not to mention the fans of Nintendo that had already seen the horrors of the Virtual Boy. Many of them were worried that the Nintendo 64 would be similar. Dear God, what if it was red! Of course, this doesn't mean that the Nintendo 64 bombed in any kind of way. In fact, it did really well while it was on the market, selling upwards of 30 million systems compared to the Virtual Boy's 1 million systems and Sega Saturn's 10 million systems. The N64 just couldn't compete with Sony's PlayStation's 100 million systems sold, but a path was set going forward. Sega had one more console left in them, PlayStation was on top, and Nintendo was a close second. Not to mention, there was talk about a new company getting into the gaming market. The console war was about to become the greatest and most brutal event in history, far surpassing fucking Saratoga, and everyone was ready for it. But there was one other thing that happened. Apple released the Apple Pippin, which was their first gaming console. Yeah, no wonder it sold like shit. Anyway.
Hey everyone, there's nothing like an existential crisis start your morning. I would know. What the hell? I was planning on getting robbed next week. Gonna have to reschedule. Fuck.
Hey person!
I'm with the Intergalactic Virginity Police Force, a futuristic division of GameGo, the
Greatest video game store of all time. I know, I've shopped there before. Why are you here?
You've been talking about video game history for way too long without mentioning the Pong crash of 1977. That's what I'm here to do. I'm here to enforce that.
Okay. Why are you here again?
It is your duty, as a virgin, to talk about it. We've been over this. I could have sworn I came here like a couple months ago. Just get back to your desk and keep talking about Pong.
Or what?
There are very few absolutes in life. Death, Pokemon being a top seller, and video game crashes. Oh, thank God. I thought I was gonna die. I stand corrected. Video game crashes, a true absolute in the history of video games. One of the most major examples was the second crash in 1983 after an overabundance of Atari games were being released, overstimulating the market and its consumers. The only thing that saved the video game market was the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System in North America in 1985. And then there was the computer game crash that resulted from an overabundance of computer systems in a market, many of which were low quality and their accompanying computer games. And then there's the people who believe we are in another video game crash right now, with a large quantity of third-party games being developed for popular game consoles, the rise of digital gaming, and the less competition within the home gaming market. Not to mention the shitty mobile games that are being advertised and developed en masse. But there's also the first video game crash of all time, the Pong crash of 1977. Pong was just so easy to code, it was so simplistic that everyone was throwing it on their consoles. I mean, watch this. Get a line. Great. Now multiply it by 2. Now space them out evenly away from the screen, leaving space between the lines. Get a ball. Put it in the center. Give it basic physics where the ball is able to bounce off our lines. Add a point system that gives a point to the opposing side when the ball goes past an opposing line on the opposing side. Add some graphics, and now you have Pong. It was just so simple and basic that any system could run it. So, to cash in on the quick rise of non-arcade video games and the now expanding home market of video game systems, many consoles began coming out very quickly, all of them just the same game over and over again, Pong. And all of these companies lacked one major thing: creativity.
GameGo's creative.
You are literally a parody version of GameStop. Since all these early at-home game consoles were made purely as cash grabs, they all played overly basic games, not wanting to expand the gaming world with new innovations. Instead, we had Pong, and Pong, and then Pong, all on different consoles. Sure, some consoles had different games on them, but they were all largely overshadowed by the overabundance of at-home Pong machines. Like, guys, Pong is inspired by tennis, or table tennis. Just play that. Or throw a ball with your friends. Instead, so many people just stared at this. Thrilling. Dude, I'm sorry. I can't keep talking about the Pong crash. It's just such a meaningless, nothing topic.
I mean, there is a reason it's called the Forgotten Video Game Crash. Wikipedia only has like 3 sentences on it. It was at a part of video game history that video games were still defining themselves, and it ultimately got completely overshadowed by the Atari crash in 1983. So there's no point. Why do you want me to continue to talk about this? Hey everyone, this is good. Real good. I probably lost a couple of y'all back there talking about Skibidi Toilet, Five Nights at Freddy's, and Weezer. Ugh. But now that things are back to normal, we can finally go back to talking about the history of video games. Previously, we were talking about the introduction of 3D gaming with the PS1, Nintendo 64, and the failure of the Sega Saturn. But now, we enter the 6th generation of gaming, beginning with
the Sega Dreamcast, Sega's last-ditch effort to stay in the gaming hardware industry. After the failure of the Saturn with its sudden release, lack of retailers willing to sell, Sega began trying to keep themselves from going bankrupt. Launching in September 9th, 1999, the console was initially received well with day one releases like Arrow Rings, Flag to Flag, Monaco Grand Prix, MK Gold, and Sonic Adventure. Surely Sonic Adventure will be the saving grace for Sega and its Dreamcast. He is, after all, the signature cool guy of the 90s.
Yeah, most kids that grew up with Sonic way back when kind of started to mature a little bit more and began focusing on newer consoles, more adult consoles such as the PS1. What especially did not help was the decline of Sonic games at the time. See, this was Sonic's first ever fully 3D game. Sure, they had attempted previously with pseudo 3D, similar to Donkey Kong Country. However, this was the first time that it was a major 3D game. But Sonic was just way too late. Mario already had the Mario 64 title and a perfect Mario 3D game for the time. Same with many other Nintendo characters. They had added an extra dimension to their Ds. And the PlayStation itself was literally made for 3D gaming as a whole, with games like Spyro and Crash Bandicoot. Sega was just simply way too late to the party, and it was unrecoverable for them. And what really didn't help was the console that was released just a year later.
The PlayStation 2, by far the best-selling console of all time. The PS1 was so successful that many were left wondering where Sony would go with their next console. But no one expected what ended up happening. They made their console play DVDs.
The Industrial Revolution is back!
This simple addition easily allowed Sony and the PlayStation to push Sega out of the hardware industry and into the gaming software industry, where they had no choice but to make third-party games for consoles. And this is all without mentioning the fact that the PS2 was backwards compatible, allowing you to play PS1 games within the PS2. And then they released the console to be smaller, cheaper, and more compact. After the PS2's release on October 26, 2000, Sony released the PS2 Slim 4 years later on November 25, 2004.
Sonic was finally dead. Nintendo's longest running rival and only true competition was defeated. Now there were only really 2 main contenders in the gaming market, Nintendo and PlayStation. While Sony had control over the home gaming market, Nintendo had a basically entire hold onto the handheld department with the Game Boy and its multiple variations. But on November 18th, 2001, Nintendo had something incredibly special in store. Something that would put them, hopefully, back on top.
They made a purple box.
Coolest thing ever.
November 18th, 2001, the day of reckoning. The day Nintendo made a box with discs. Nintendo had finally integrated discs into their systems, but they did it in, of course, the Nintendo way, by not making them normal CD-sized discs, introducing the GameCube mini discs. And get this, the only reason they made the discs smaller was because the Nintendo GameCube was their attempt at making their consoles more portable, which is why it features love handles on the back. By using smaller discs, the system could be smaller and could be carried around far easier than the PS2 or the Sega Dreamcast.
But there was one thing that Nintendo forgot.
The fact that no one was going to carry around a purple box with them. It's not like there was a portable screen that you could just, attach onto the GameCube and then it could be a perfectly portable console, right? Spoke too soon. To maintain the idea that the GameCube was meant to be a more powerful portable console, Nintendo released a portable, attachable GameCube screen. There was just one other problem. If you made a game to have a small size and made a screen to fit that small size, the screen itself would be small as well. This was a small issue, though, as many ended up buying it purely for convenience. But due to Nintendo's very kid-friendly marketing and how kid-safe Nintendo was known to be, the GameCube sold far less than the PlayStation and original Xbox that were released the same way. The GameCube was too kiddie to most. They wanted to play more hardcore games like Halo or Rayman. So, Nintendo pivoted and tried to appeal to the more older generation of gamers with their first M-rated game, Eternal Darkness: Sandy's Requiem. And then got it. After the failed marketing that left the GameCube with less units sold than Nintendo was expecting, something that would become more and more relevant as time went on, Nintendo began considering pulling out of the video game hardware market and becoming a game studio, like Sega. But Nintendo needed to give their consoles one last chance. But before that, Microsoft was going to become big and hard. Pause. The original Xbox, released on November 15th, 2001, 3 days before the GameCube. There was already talk about Microsoft coming into the gaming market because Sony was already in there with the PlayStation, and Microsoft was a major competitor to Sony as a whole. But with the PlayStation having so many additional parts such as a DVD reader, Xbox needed to differentiate themselves to make the original Xbox known. So they made it bigger by adding an internal hard drive into the console itself. See, the PlayStation 2, and GameCube all utilized game cards. They acted as a way to store data outside the console to make the console smaller and more affordable, as well as easier to produce. But Xbox needed a gimmick, so they made game cards obsolete and added an internal hard drive within the console itself. And somehow it worked. Everyone wanted to play games without having to insert a card just to save your game, not to mention some of their titles like Halo and Halo. So, that was it. Sega was booted out of the video game market, Sony all the way on top, second place going to the original Xbox, and last place to the Nintendo GameCube. Nintendo only had one console left before they too, just like Sega, would be booted out of the market. And Xbox had introduced an internal hard drive allowing you to basically have internal storage into your consoles without having excess storage like the memory cards. So, where do we go from here? Well, unfortunately, you'll have to wait till next video in order for us to continue talking about the history of video game consoles. I know, cliffhangers suck, I would know, but trust me, it will be absolutely worth it with the 7th generation of consoles. Hey everyone, welcome back to Video Game History. This time, we'll be tackling the 7th generation of consoles. But before that, let's catch up on the 6th generation. After the extremely large success of the Sony PlayStation 2 and Xbox's new innovation of internal hard drive into a console, alongside Sega being completely booted out of the console industry, and Nintendo close behind with the underperformance of the GameCube. The new era of video games was on the horizon as 2005 was slowly approaching, and Xbox was going to start off at Gen 7 with a bang. The Xbox 360, objectively the peak of video games as a whole. After the release of the original Xbox, many consumers were a bit upset about a few designs of the Xbox. The controller was way too bulky, the console itself was a giant brick. So Microsoft needed a way to make their next console just a little bit different, smaller, more aerodynamic, and more futuristic. And then, on November 22nd, 2005, the new Xbox was released. Xbox 2? Damn! I'm about to bust. The Xbox 360, the future of gaming in your home for the price of $299 to $399, with an internal hard drive, sporting a new compact, futuristic design with an incredible controller. Also, completely backwards compatible with the original Xbox games. The graphics rivaled with high-end PCs at the time. The console itself was heavily designed to accommodate for online gaming as it was becoming more and more popular in the early 2000s. It had the ability to play DVDs. This was the biggest improvement to the original Xbox anyone could have ever expected, but it wasn't without its flaws.
See, the major design of the Xbox 360 ended up becoming its downfall. The fact that it was so slim. See, the issue with that is when you had a bigger, more bulkier console, its parts were able to spread out just a little bit more, causing damage to be more rare. However, when you put a lot of these components very, very close together, they can easily overheat, or if something were to accidentally drop onto the console itself, all it takes is for something to just hit the wrong part, causing another part to hit another part, and another part to hit another part, and then your entire console just breaks. These breaks resulted in the console to display a red ring around the start button of the console. This would of course become known as the red ring of death.
This issue spread far and fast, countless systems breaking for one reason or another, displaying the red ring of death. This news quickly reached Microsoft, who were aware of the issue. Quickly, Microsoft began working on a revision of the system. Then, in 2007, 2 years after the original Xbox 360's release, the Xbox Elite was released for $479, featuring a less compact design to prevent red rings, 120 gigabytes of internal space, and an HDMI, which was the new standard. A pretty massive change for only $200 or more. And then, to further prolong the Xbox 360's lifespan and compete with the PS3's slim model, the Xbox 360S was released in 2010 with a lighter build, more space, and built-in Wi-Fi support. But the S was redesigned 3 years later, in 2013, into the Xbox 360E, which had a bulkier design as somewhat of a demo for the Xbox One, which was announced alongside the 360E.
And then there were the extensions. With the Xbox's ability to play DVDs, Xbox and Microsoft ended up taking part of the large format war, and by large I mean incredibly short. This was of course between Blu-ray and HD DVD. If you don't know what HD DVD is, then you can probably guess who won. Microsoft then developed the HD DVD drive for the Xbox 360, which was bundled in alongside King Kong 2005 version or something like that. It was a King Kong movie in HD DVD format, and it was bundled in. And then the HD DVD format, of course, failed, which caused the extension to be discontinued very quickly in 2008, only 2 years after its original release. And then there was the extra extension, something to compete with the motion controls of the time. The PlayStation Move, and of course the Nintendo Wii, which we'll get to in a bit. This was of course the Kinect.
The Kinect for the Xbox 360. Rather than having a remote that tracks you where you aim it, you are the remote. In theory, this idea was huge for the industry. Not only does it make you have to play the game rather than sitting around and flicking the controller in the air, but in practice, the Kinect was incredibly difficult to use. First, you'd have to clear out a large space,
And if you don't have a large enough room, well, too bad.
then set up the Kinect at a height where you're easily visible to it, then put your game and start playing it. But what makes it so bad? Simple, the fact that the Kinect may not perfectly read your movements. Oh, you jumped? Well, you jumped a little bit too high, so the Kinect didn't really see it. Oh, you moved left? Yeah, well, not enough. However, despite its poor functionality, the Kinect produced some amazing games like Kinect Star Wars, Wipeout 1, 2, and 3, Just Dance, Puss in Boots, and even
Kinect Adventures was by far the worst sin ever committed by Microsoft, Xbox, and of course, the Kinect. The entire game was basically a demo to show just what the Kinect can do, which sounds amazing in concept. However, where it went wrong was the fact that it was on the Kinect.
Kinect Adventures force you to move around a lot. Jumping, side steps, moving your arms, your legs, entire body. All of this made the game so difficult because of how poorly the Kinect tracks movement. Half the time, your jump isn't registered, or your movement would just not show. All without mentioning the literal hell that is multiplayer. Yes, this game has multiplayer. Yippee! Moving on from the Xbox 360, a year after the Xbox 360's initial release, PlayStation released the PS3. After the perfection and innovation of the PS2, PlayStation would have to continue improving with the PS3 in order to keep themselves all the way on top. And with the Xbox 360 doing so well, they would really have to seriously grind to keep that top position. The PS3 completely changed everything a PlayStation was. After the original Xbox internal hard drive, Sony began working on their next console having its own internal hard drive. Also, as the previously mentioned format war began, Sony helped contribute it by including built-in Blu-ray support. The console itself was also natively backwards compatible, so what went wrong? Money. The console itself was released at a base price of $499, a whole $200 more expensive than the 360's base price. Granted, the PS3 came with 20 gigabytes with an even more expensive version with 60 gigabytes at $599. It was an immediate turnoff for gamers. The 360 was leagues cheaper and had already been out for a whole year. Something had to change if PlayStation wanted to stay on top, especially with Nintendo's new console on the way. So, PlayStation made price cuts, dropping the prices by a crisp $100. The 200GB edition dropped to $399, and the 600GB edition dropped to $499. Although Xbox was still in the lead by a pretty large margin, the PS3 was starting to become a more viable and better option in comparison. For the same price as a 360 with 20GB, you could get a PS3 with 20GB, a Blu-ray drive, less breakable design, and better motion controls, which we'll get to later. This idea was later enhanced by the PS3's Slim model released in 2009. This made the entire console much lighter and smaller in exchange for backwards compatibility. The PS3 Slim sold at a marginally cheaper price of only $299. By this point, the PS3 had become the obvious choice for those who either wanted to get into gaming or those who still had their PS2s. But PlayStation kept on getting better and better as the PS3 got older and older. To adjust the console for the size of Bill Gates' dick, to make the console just that bit smaller and to compete with the 360e model, and to keep the console alive a bit longer, the PS3 Super Slim was released in 2012. All that changed was the weight of the console and storage capacity, now with a massive 120 gigabytes or more already bundled in with the console. All of this helped push the PS3 much higher than it was initially. However, nothing could surpass the insurmountable advantage that the Xbox 360 had over the PS3. Except for one thing. Motion controls. I swear it's not what it looks like. The PlayStation Move. Made to compete with Nintendo's console, and that was pretty much it. Support for the platform was pretty limited due to the amount of games Nintendo had with their own motion controls. The PS Move was silently abandoned, but did come back in 2016 with the PS4 VR's controls. Now on to Nintendo's console. After the GameCube's less than successful release, alongside steep competition with the original Xbox and PS2, Nintendo would soon be out of the market completely, with the exception of their handhelds, which will be tackled in another video. So, rather than focusing on a console to compete with the market itself, Nintendo wanted to focus on a more casual consumer basis of a console. And so, the Nintendo Wii was developed. The Wii heavily focused on motion controls, something that was incredibly new at the time. The PS2 had briefly tried to integrate them with the iToy, but Nintendo would be taking a step further. Small remotes called Wiimotes would use infrared tracking to send info to the system for movement. The controls were incredibly responsive for the time, and countless games were made with these gimmicks. The Wii, of course, also had backwards compatibility with the GameCube alongside Wi-Fi support. Granted, it wasn't the best. Alongside an internal hard drive, and a virtual console that allowed you to buy games and play them from older generations like the NES, SNES, and N64. And then, in 2006, the Nintendo Wii was released to the public for only $249. And it did amazingly. Being the cheapest console on the market, $50 cheaper than the 360 and $250 cheaper than the PS3, the Wii quickly rose to popularity upon its release. Another thing that really helped it was its marketing. The Wii was constantly shown to be this new way to exercise and have fun, which was a main selling point with games like Wii Sports, Wii Sports Resort, Wii Fit, Wii Play, Wii Motion, and so much more. Heck, the Zelda game of the console required motion controls, which hilariously failed during a showcase at E3. All these factors helped make the console so successful with casual gamers, new gamers, and experienced gamers. The casual and new gamers especially, as many older people began buying the Wii for themselves to use for exercising, but not other games. This is why you see such high sales for the Wii and such marginally low sales for any other game for the Wii, such as Mario Galaxy or any other game that wasn't bundled in with the Wii itself. Regardless, the Wii was a massive success and kept Nintendo at the top for the entire 7th generation of gaming. The Xbox 360 and PS3 were forced to duke it out for second place, with the Xbox 360 ending up winning due to the console's competitive edge. And so, that was the end of the 7th generation of video games. Now, Nintendo was back, only because of the Wii's usability for exercise. The 360 showed just how well Xbox and Microsoft could do, and the PS3 showed just how small hardware can get, and how greedy companies can also be. Moving into the 8th generation would be interesting. All these platforms were at the top of their game. Where could it all go wrong? I've been Seb, and thank you for watching. Hey everyone, welcome back to the history of video games. After the extreme success of the Xbox 360 alongside a lot of its changes, the decline of sales for the PS3, and the massive success for the Wii U, specifically the console, as many of the games for the Wii didn't really sell very well. Regardless, the 7th generation of consoles were amazing. Motion controls were being rapidly developed on, and hardware for graphics was more available than ever before, and consoles were taking advantage of this. So, with the changes of the 7th generation, the 8th generation would also need to continue to change and be innovative in order to keep up with the times. And all of this started with the Wii U. Oh, god damn it. Look, I've been a major fan of Nintendo ever since I was born, but with the Wii's game sales not doing very well, alongside the decline of the 3DS and 2DS, and as we'll see, the marketing of the Wii U, we were entering the dark age of Nintendo, and I don't think I can handle this alone. Which is why I hired a therapist, and I have a therapy appointment right now.
So, what brings you back now? More books?
No, the dark age of Nintendo.
Oh. Well, go ahead.
Nintendo was back on top. The DS had done near perfectly and had the capacity to play interchangeable pseudo 3D games on a handheld. The Wii was marketed towards casual consumers and sold massively. But through all of this, Nintendo had one main issue. Casual consumers were only buying the consoles, not games for the consoles, with a few exceptions. So, with the next console, Nintendo would have to fix all of this without losing their primary customers. So, they made something new, something that combined both the Wii with their handhelds.
The Wii U and the Wii U gamepad.
Isn't that just a Wii?
Yes, but it was a new console entirely. Nintendo was now known for the Wii, so they had to keep going with the brand. The system consisted of the Wii U console and a gamepad. The console would connect to the TV and provide either another screen or a larger screen to play on. The gamepad, however, worked as a touchscreen controller and separate screen for closer gameplay for separate games, like a DS.
In a lot of ways, the Wii U was just a more technically advanced DS, and best of all, you didn't really need a TV to play most Wii U games.
All you needed was the Wii U gamepad and the console plugged in close nearby. Sure, it wasn't the most practical, but the Wii U was also released in 2012.
Right. So where does it all go wrong?
What happened to the other guy?
He stepped out. I'm his Philip. Continue.
The marketing. See, where the Wii U messed up was how it marketed itself. Historically, Nintendo has had this problem before, with the SNES and marketing it to sound like it's just an upgrade of the already existing NES, rather than its own thing. With the Game Boy Color, marketing it to look like it's just the same Game Boy, but with color. Same thing happened to the Game Boy SP and Game Boy Advance. With the DS, as the future DSs were released, like the DSi, 2DS, 3DS, and their XL models, the marketing made it all sound like they're just different variations of the regular DS. Now, with the Wii, marketed to casual consumers who know very little about gaming, many people saw the Wii U only as a new gamepad and controller, not a new console. It was just another attachment for the Wii, just like the millions of Wiimote attachments. Because of this, the Wii U struggled severely. This led Nintendo to make some interesting choices for their console exclusive. 35 total exclusives, each worse than the last. From the cheap cash grabs of Dr. Luigi and Game & Wario, to the re-releases of Wind Waker HD and Twilight Princess HD, to the lacking and janky Sonic Boom Rise of the Lyric, and, of course, the horrors of Mario Party 10 and Mario Tennis Ultra Smash. There is also a game called Meme Run, which is a very real game and was removed for the, I kid you not, unlicensed use of the troll face meme. This is a real game. Look it up. Like, what?
All of these factors led to an incredibly poor release and even worse runtime on the market for the Wii U. A total of only 793 games, 208 if you only count the physical ones, and only 166 if you count of those the ones released in North America. To say the Wii U failed would be an understatement. The Wii U was Nintendo's greatest fail and almost caused another bankruptcy in the company.
Not to mention all the other consoles that were released at the same time.
Exactly. Well, I'ma head out. Thank you so much, Mr. Therapist.
Glad I could help.
Hey everyone! I'm tied up to a chair. Anyway, time to talk about PS4. After the Wii U's release and downfall in 2012, the competition began focusing to the two other major parties in the console wars, PlayStation and Xbox. After the incredibly poor release of the PS3, many were hoping PlayStation would change and make a better console on release. These hopes would be answered with the release of the PS4, specifically made to be more affordable, developer-friendly, and with the latest and greatest graphics and processing power in the market. Released for $399, the PS4 was near perfect on release. Sure, the price was quite high and the PS4 didn't have any backwards compatibility features, but the console itself and its relative price compared to other consoles on the market, alongside the specs, this console was amazing. All of this without mentioning the PS4's variations and the PSVR. In 2016, 4 years after the original release, Sony announced the release of the PS4 Pro and PS4 Slim, two models of the PS4 meant to prolong the console's lifespan and allow for price cuts. The PS Slim was released for $299 with very few technical changes to make the console lighter. The PS4 Pro was only released for $399. If you remember, that's the exact same price as the base PS4. However, the only major change was its ability to display 4K resolution, the new standard of gaming. And then there was the major addition of the PSVR. Motion controls had already been a major part of gaming, especially with the 7th generation. However, no one had really been able to integrate VR into a normal console experience. VR was always treated as this separate thing with VR consoles like the Oculus. That was until the PS4's VR system. With VR becoming a big deal at the time, Sony wanted to get a head start into the platform while still maintaining support for the PS4. So, in October of 2016, the PS4 VR system was released. And I mean, it did okay. Where it did poorly was the lack of first-party support. The PSVR almost entirely ran off of third-party ports from the Oculus VR system. Plus, many of the games present were quick mini-game type games that had you explore an area in VR, and then you're done. Man, I sure do wish I could waste $30 right now. No way! Although its usability was limited, it was a major stepping stone in the gaming industry. VR could now be on a console rather than its own standalone thing. And as companies got better at designing games in VR, surely more games would be available in the future. Plus, it was nice to see the return of the PS3 PlayStation Move controllers. However, with how successful the PSVR was after the failure of the Wii U, from here, it was simply only downhill. With how successful the PS4 after the failure of the Wii U, it was only downhill from here with the Xbox One. After the massive success that was the Xbox 360, many people were left wondering what happens next for Xbox. A few unfunny jokes about how Microsoft can't count, and the Xbox One was finally revealed. E3 2013, the Xbox One was unveiled. A more traditional box design, but its features were what defined it as the future. An all-in-one entertainment system, live TV, media streaming, social media, and so much more, alongside gaming. Initially, this sounded amazing. And then they kept talking. Anti-consumer policies, blocking all third-party accessories, pre-owned games would require additional payment, online requirements, and yes, Kinect requirement. Yes, the Kinect made a return for a few months before dying out, finally. All of these anti-consumer policies caused mass outcry from gamers. Luckily, Microsoft listened and released the console on November 2nd, 2013. There was just one major issue. Everything was missing. Live TV was almost non-existent alongside social media, though streaming services like Twitch were easily available on the console. All of the policies were eventually revised, and pre-owned games were still cheaper, and you could still use third-party, accessories. However, nothing could fix the state of the Xbox One and public perception of the console. A base price of $499. For context, the PS4 was an objectively better console and had less starting restrictions, and was released for $100 cheaper at $399, with a Pro version coming later on for the exact same price. A solid $100 difference. So, with the hated pre-release plans and a massive price difference, the Xbox One wasn't looking very appealing. But in 2016, the Xbox One S was released, with the Xbox One X coming in 2017. And if you're wondering what changed, me too. The major change was 4K HD visuals and extra space for digital gaming, which was quickly on the rise for some people. Aside from that, it served as just an upgrade to compete with the PS4 Pro and PS4 Slim. The Xbox One S was decently cheap at $299, and the Xbox One X was the normal $499. But with these re-releases and price cuts, the Xbox One seriously struggled in sales as time continued. Looking back, it's pretty interesting that Xbox had almost the exact same issues that the PS3 had an entire generation prior. This pattern, as you'll see, does end up repeating a lot with the Xbox Series consoles and the generation prior with the Wii U. But with that, the 8th generation was over. The Wii U was a massive failure, but Nintendo still had enough money and resources from the Wii to pull through for a 9th generation console. The PS4 was all the way on the top with their VR system, and just how amazing the PS4 did overall. And the Xbox One redefined rock bottom after the perfection of the Xbox 360. So finally, in the next video, we will be discussing the modern age of video game consoles with the 9th generation. I've been Seb, and thank you for watching. Have a great day. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video of video game history. When we last left off, Nintendo was all the way at the bottom with their worst selling console yet, the Wii U. Xbox got very greedy with the Xbox One and their pre-release anti-consumer policies. However, those were eventually changed. And PlayStation had peaked with the PS4 and PS4 VR being implemented into consoles. Now, we look forward to our modern generation. Will Nintendo finally be booted out of the market? Will the PS5 be this massive new console with so many innovations? And will Xbox finally do something new with their consoles? Well, let's find out.
To kick off the 9th generation, the Nintendo Switch was released in 2017, only 5 years after the release of the Wii U. Most Nintendo fans, such as myself, were pretty worried about what the Switch could entail. The idea behind it was extremely experimental, choosing to combine both console and handheld aspects into a singular console. The console became known as a hybrid console, with detachable controllers made for multiplayer and a dock that you could put the console into high performance mode and cast the gameplay to a TV. This had never really been done before, but it was an incredibly innovative idea. The ads and marketing for the system and its games also held up the console, generating pre-release hype. The Switch was shaping up to be an incredible release, and that's exactly what we got.
The release of the Nintendo Switch was phenomenal, to say the least. Most stores completely sold out of the console within days, and Nintendo kept the console at a pretty reasonable price at $299. Within less than a year, the Nintendo Switch had completely outsold the Wii U, mostly due to the phenomenal exclusives on the console, like Breath of the Wild, Splatoon 2, Mario Odyssey, and so many more. And this list only increased as time went on.
2019 saw the release of the Nintendo Switch Lite, a smaller handheld-only Nintendo Switch for only $199.
And then 2020 happened. Yay!
For many of us, 2020 was a dark year. But then there was Animal Crossing: New Horizons. New Horizons was released at a perfect time. Many non-gamers wanted something to play and relax with while stuck at home, and Animal Crossing was the perfect match at the time. So, people went to their nearest game store and bought a Nintendo Switch and Animal Crossing.
Although, personally, I didn't really enjoy Animal Crossing because of its just slow pace and how simple it is. It wasn't for me. But I could understand why it was the main reason so many people bought the Nintendo Switch. It was a peaceful little escape from everything outside. And I think that was honestly amazing.
And then sales kept rising and rising, more units sold each day. Then, 2021 had the release of the stronger Nintendo Switch, the Nintendo Switch OLED. Better speakers, better screen, better, well, everything. The hardware was also enhanced for the time, which was incredible considering the fact that a Lemon battery is more powerful than the Switch. Now, it was at least 3 lemons.
However, just like any other console, the Nintendo Switch had its own faults. The Joy-Cons, the Nintendo Switch's controllers that could be detached from the consoles, were incredibly tightly packed with electronics, something that we've seen as an issue with the Xbox 360 before. If the electronics were to slightly shift or hit another part, the entire controller would either break, or, if you were incredibly unlucky, would cause different button presses to be inputted and stick drift to become a major problem. Of course, Nintendo was aware of this, and rather than trying to fix their mistake, they chose to gaslight everyone. Hello, this is Nintendo Supports. How may I help you?
Hey, so I'm calling because my controllers, like, they just kind of stopped working. Like, I can't really use them to play games anymore, because, like, they keep doing stuff that I am not doing.
What? Broken? No. You have no idea what you're talking. I don't even know what you're talking about. Broken Joy-Con, please.
I mean, you sure? Like, plenty of people have the same issue. Like, there's no way I'm the only one who's having this problem. I've heard it like 5 other times this week.
No, you misunderstand. Your controllers aren't broken. They're just... They're just experiencing a new feature that we just rolled out for the console.
Okay, well, like, is there anything I can do to fix them? Like, are there any settings I can screw with?
Fix what?
The controllers.
What about them?
They are broken. Hello?
What are controllers? Eventually, this issue was resolved with Nintendo releasing a very difficult and very hard to reach website that allowed you to send in your Joy-Cons and they'd repair them for a small price. And then there was the next issue. What next? The Switch was nearly perfect, and now Nintendo only had 2 main options. Either A, next generation they're going to once again split their handhelds and home consoles into different separate console things, or B, they keep remaking the Switch. The Switch's idea was just too good, and it's hard to imagine where they go from here. And if Nintendo continues to remake the Switch, eventually they'll make a Switch 2, and the Wii U, Game Boy DS issues will all repeat again. Most will see it as the Switch. Again. Nintendo is in a very tricky situation, and I think that's why, despite the console being almost 7 years old, we have yet to hear about any information on a legitimate Nintendo Switch successor. But with the Nintendo Switch all caught up on, it's time to move on to the next console. Google Stadia. Bad cloud gaming service. Sucked immensely, but it was a half-decent idea. My only interaction with it was when I made a tweet talking about how the Stadia controller mashes a bunch of parts of other controllers like the PS4, Nintendo Switch Pro controller, and the Xbox One controllers kind of all into one and takes like their best parts. And then Google Stadia was like, glad you like our controller. And that's the most conversation I've ever had with Google Stadia. I haven't played anything on Google Stadia. It's never been something I wanted to do. I think that's funny. Anyway, the Xbox One series systems. Not consoles, they're systems. They're just Xbox Ones, but better. Listen to me. They are not consoles. Hey everyone, I'm Green. You've probably seen me before. I was here too. I'll be filling in for Seb2 while he's sleeping. Anyway, the Xbox One series systems, since they're not consoles. The Xbox Series S and X, designed to be a successor to the Xbox One. The series system served as somewhat of a transition while Xbox figured out what their next consoles were going to actually be. For the time, however, the series consoles would be released as newer, higher-end versions of the Xbox One with a lot more space, better online connectivity, and increased performance. And on November 10th, 2020, the consoles were released. Very different looks for essentially twin consoles. The Series X was a massive, very sleek, very big, modern design to it. However, its overly blocky shape was a turnoff to many. But the S, with a only slightly worse resolution, was a much better and easier on the eyes console with its smaller design. Both were incredibly blocky and modern, but this had been seen previously with the Xbox One's release. Still, this was an incredibly underwhelming release, and most gamers opted to just not upgrade their consoles. After all, the Xbox Series consoles were just better Xbox Ones. There wasn't much of a change, and the marketing itself didn't really distinguish them enough. Most games that were labeled as Xbox Series S and X with a little sticker on the corner, they didn't really change much, and it didn't warrant the price. Plus, you could still play the made for Xbox S and S on a Xbox One with a slightly worse everything, but the game was still playable. Funnily enough, the Xbox Series consoles had the exact same problem that the Wii U had a generation prior.
Ultimately, the Xbox One once again fell short, but the new systems still did decently well. Within 3 years, the Series consoles managed to sell half of the same amount as the Xbox One did in its entire 7-year lifetime. 30 million units. Granted, not the best, especially because now the sales will start to slow down. These low sales could be for a number of factors. Lack of interest in Xbox exclusives, for one, the overall disinterest in another Xbox One upgrade, and the price. The Series X was released for $499, but has dealt with significant price cuts since, and the Series S was released for $299. For a better version of an older console that you could just get used for about $100 or less, these prices were just not really worth it for many.
This includes me. I still have my original Xbox One, and I still haven't felt any need to upgrade it. Mostly due to the fact that there's not many major Xbox games that are coming out that are exclusive to the S and X systems. Hopefully with the 10th generation, Xbox will release something big and massive and a different console entirely. Maybe they'll innovate and start including VR, just like the PS4 did, into their system. However, on the topic of PlayStation, only 2 days after the Xbox Series release date, PlayStation released their own new console, the PS5.
Wow. Just wow. I have never really been a major PlayStation player, but this. Wow. 4K gaming, 825 gigabytes of high-speed storage with a massive size being owed to its robust cooling system to ensure that the PS5 was quieter than the often loud PS4. All of this with enhanced versions of the old PS4 tech, allowing for near perfect and seamless backwards compatibility with the PS4's games, allowing them to be played in amazing new resolutions. The controllers also feature a lot of built-in motors, allowing for resistance on some of the controllers to be coded in for games, all with a sleek, futuristic design. An amazing contrast to the Xbox One's blocky and modern look.
This console is amazing! But then there's the price. And the 2 different variations on release. There were 2 different versions available at release. The fully digital version for $399 and the disc version for $499. Absolutely massive amounts, especially for a console. And then there was the release. For the first couple of months after this console was released, it was nearly impossible to find this console anywhere in stores. It was just being sold out so quickly that I'm pretty sure there was websites that people would make on whether or not a Walmart had a PS5 in stock. With thousands being sold every day, no one had any opportunity to buy one of their own. So much so that eBay scalpers began reselling these consoles for almost double, maybe even triple or more of the original base price to just get extra money, and then the cycle would repeat and then get like infinite cash. However, eventually production sped up to meet consumer demand, and here we are now where you can basically go into most Walmarts and you'll find a PS5 of your own. But that was just the start. What about now?
Obviously, the state of the PS5 now is a lot better. Anyone who wants a PS5 can go to their local game store, and if they're out of stock, they'll likely be back within a week. But
what about the games? The PS4 had some amazing exclusives, not to mention the massive addition of the PS4 VR. However, the PS5 doesn't really have much of this. Only 2 major games, with the rest either flying under the radar or being re-releases or remakes. Spider-Man 2 and Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. The PS5 also had a new VR system, the PS VR 2. All that was really changed was better graphics and more advanced motion and eye tracking, and better controllers for tracking. Aside from that, not much else changed. Regardless of the state of the PS5, its sales were doing incredibly. 50 million units in only 4 years, completely outmatching the Xbox Series systems by a solid 20 million units, and this number is only going to go up from here. Of course, these sales will only go further up as the PS5 Slim and Pro models are released. Side note that wasn't included in the script, I genuinely feel like the reason why there's less PlayStation 5 exclusives that were released is I think PlayStation either has big plans for their future exclusives, or they're going way more into quality over quantity of games, because the graphics just look so realistic and beautiful, while still maintaining the look that they aren't in our own world. They're games, but it's still incredible, just the level of detail that the PS5 is able to produce. So big shout out to the teams working on the games. You are doing amazing.
And so, that was it. The Nintendo Switch was doing phenomenally well, especially after the failure of the Wii U. The Xbox Series consoles weren't doing too well, mostly due to a lack of difference between that and the original Xbox One. The PS5 was doing amazing for only 4 years on the market and a shaky original release. And Google Stadia showed us nothing, other than how tightly knit the current console wars are and how difficult it is to get a new competitor into that space. But with all this talk about the modern generation, it's difficult to imagine what consoles will look like in the next generation, Gen 10. So, what will consoles look like for Gen 10?
Hey everyone, sorry to interrupt, but with our Seb 2 out, Seb, will be taking over for now in reading the script that was previously made by a real human. Now, on to the future of gaming. Just to be clear, these are non-AI ideas and my own ideas. Would they ever happen? Probably not. But could they? Absolutely. Firstly, Xbox. With the Xbox One only getting remastered for General 9, my idea for Xbox's General 10 console is the Xbox Infinity. Essentially, the Xbox would become a customizable PC build. The base console would come with the PC frame and basic parts. From there, Xbox can release new parts to keep up with hardware as it's developed. The console itself is ever-changing as the console industry develops, and it's infinitely customizable, hence the name, not to mention the fact that Xbox has slowly been stepping into the C world with their parent company, Microsoft, releasing computers and with Game Pass being available on CSE. All of this kinda just lines up well with the direction Xbox is going. Next, PlayStation. Obviously, the next step is the Psy-6. But what would it include? Well, I'm thinking the console will go fully digital with ways to upload past games onto the system, better VOS support, and an Ultra 4K display. I also think that PlayStation will step back into the handheld industry, for a reason I'll mention later. Maybe, for General 11, the 7 will be similar to the Xbox Infinity, but that's just wishful thinking. PlayStation will likely be one of the last true console experiences as everyone switches to cloud gaming or cease. Speaking of switching, where would Nintendo go? I personally think General 10 will be the death of Nintendo. As it stands, Nintendo doesn't have much they can do with their next console. As I mentioned before, either they go back to separate handheld and console experiences, or they go full console, or they make the Switch 2. As far as leaks, right now, the Switch 2 is most probable, but if it is called the Switch 2, Nintendo's sales will fall again, just like with the Wii to Wii U, Game Boys, and DS systems.
And if Nintendo goes full console, there will be a gap in the handheld market, perfect for PlayStation to take with their handheld. Regardless, I feel Nintendo's time is beginning to come to an end. After the state of the Wii U's failures and what their future looks to be turning into, they don't have much time left. Calling it now by General 15, at the latest, Nintendo will be gone. But with Nintendo out of the market, likely becoming a third-party developer like Sega who will step in, well, hear me out. Google Stadia 2. Yes, Google Stadia sucked, but I have a new idea for Google Stadia. Google can go and purchase companies and their past catalogs and have them all available on one system. Retro games, new releases, remakes, and so much more. Google has the money to do this. They could buy developers like Rare, Sega, and Nintendo and have their games on Stadia too. Not to mention the support Stadia 2 could give to indie titles with the platform. Yes, I know I basically just described Steam. Speaking of Steam, Stadia could absolutely integrate Steam as part of its system. All of these different games on one system, whether it's a console or a cloud gaming service or an app. This could, in theory. Google just needs to do it right and market it all correctly. So yeah, those are my predictions for General 10. Will they come true? Probably not, but they're pretty great ideas in my opinion. Anyway, I've been Azebud. Have a great one.
Hey everyone! This is pretty neat. It's small, it's compact, it's fun to just fidget around with. I can easily hold it in my hands, and it doesn't require any extra hardware. It's a perfect little gaming system. Oh. Never mind. The handheld video game console, a staple in gaming as a whole, and also the only way Nintendo stayed relevant after 1989. Handheld video game consoles are small, well, handheld gaming devices that allowed you to play games from a publisher with minimal extra hardware, like the Nintendo Game Boy. You'd slot in a game and start playing on a dimly lit green screen. But even though Nintendo is known for their handheld consoles, they weren't the first. That honor would of course go to Mattel in 1976 with the first ever handheld game, Auto Race. Now, this release was huge for the time. Not to mention, it was an entire year before the Atari 2600 was released, and 4 years after the Magnavox Odyssey was released. The very fact that this tiny little handheld was able to play anything at all at this level was incredible. So, seeing this, every company knew what they had to do. Plagiarism. Nintendo was, of course, the first to hop onto this revolutionary idea. After 100 years of being a card and toy manufacturer, Nintendo saw the rise of video games in the market with the Atari 2600 and the Pong game consoles, resulting in the Pong crash. So, in 1989, Nintendo released a line of handheld LCD game systems called Game & Watch. They were pretty simple games, just something small to pass the time. It used the same technology as an LCD calculator, the kind that you see out of school, where charge is sent to a series of pixels that show an image. But there's something different about the Game & Watch systems not previously seen before. They had the capacity to have 2 screens and run 2 different games on the same system. At the same time, in late 1979, the Milton Bradley Company made their very first handheld known as the Microvision. It was also the very first handheld to use interchangeable cartridges, which really changed the high-end market for handhelds at the time. Your handheld wasn't shit if it couldn't play Breakout and then be switched out with Vegas slots. The Microvision also used LCDs, but it was quickly discontinued for 3 major problems. 1, poor keypads. The keypads on the Microvision were designed to be overly thick with a thin printed plastic overlay to last longer. However, this heavily backfired and caused the plastic to stretch more and more and eventually just deteriorate. 2, screen rot, which was the result of the LCD leaking and causing permanent dark spots on the screen. And 3, ESD damage, due to a lack of protection on the microprocessor. In the event that someone opened up the console's protective door, the console would be subject to any static charge the user has built up, causing it to immediately short circuit. While the Microvision was first to utilize game cartridges, it ultimately failed due to its ambitious small size, much like myself. However, Nintendo would take this design and alter it for themselves to make their brand new and highly successful handheld, the Game Boy. After the major success of the NES, Nintendo knew they had to keep riding this incredible high that they stumbled upon, and what better way to do that than to ride with you. Introducing the Game Boy, released in 1989 and utilizing game cartridges, because your handheld wasn't shit if it couldn't play Pokemon and then be switched out with Pokemon. Or Tetris. The handheld itself was incredibly bulky, which makes sense given the fact that it needed 4 AA batteries and a processor to run all the information on an actual digital screen. Of course, to keep the handheld simple, the Game Boy ran off of binary, meaning it could only display pixels as on or off. This resulted in pretty lackluster games with overly simplified graphics. However, it still sold massively, boosting Nintendo even further. All without mentioning games like Tetris, Pokemon, Kirby, Pokemon Again, Link's Awakening, Kirby 2, Pokemon a third time, Dr. Mario, and who could forget Pokemon for the 4th time. But Atari was close behind with their very own handheld, the Atari Lynx, also released in 1989, with a backlit screen and a color display, both things that the Game Boy lacked, and the ability to be flipped for left-hand players. How did this fail? Unfortunately for the Lynx, the Game Boy was just way too widely known, and ultimately completely overshadowed the Lynx release. Not to mention the lack of developer support and how quickly it drained batteries. The Lynx was just inferior to the Game Boy, all things considered. From here, not many major releases or changes happened at the market, so I'm just going to read off my script. The Turbo Express was just a Game Boy but with better resolution. The BitCorp Game Mate was just kind of there, and then it wasn't. The Sega Game Gear was just the Sega Master System shrunk into a handheld for Sega to press more competition onto Nintendo, which they were already doing plenty with the Genesis by itself and its incredible marketing. The Watsura Supervision was just a Game Boy, but compact, and for TVs, and that's about it. And then in 1994, we saw the release of the Super Game Boy, which wasn't a handheld. Instead, it was a cartridge that could be inserted into the SNES and allowed you to play Game Boy games on the big screen. But finally, something big would happen in 1995 with Sega's Nomad handheld. This was designed to be the next big thing for Sega, but at the time, Sega was already dealing with 5 consoles, all at the same time. The Genesis, Master System, Game Gear, Pico, a computer software, and the new Sega Saturn alongside the CD and 32X add-ons for their consoles. Having a new handheld would just be way too much for the company to handle. So Sega opted to just hope for the best for the handheld, giving it minimal support and opting to focus on their favorite child, the Sega Saturn, which still failed. 1996 saw the release of the Tamagotchi, an LCD digital pet device, and Nintendo's remake of the Game Boy, given the new technological advancements. This would be the Game Boy Pocket, which was just a Game Boy, but small. It did okay, but with the lack of difference between it and the original Game Boy, not many people saw a reason to buy it. 1997 had the release of the Gamecom, which was the first touchscreen. And that's about it. As I'm sure you've noticed, handhelds really didn't progress very much very quickly over time compared to the console industry. It was just a very slow burn until something big would happen. Digital color screens are now everywhere. Forget everything I just said, the handheld market is a fast burn. With the release of the first color smartphone, the Siemens S10, in 1998, color screens were now extremely easy to find and replicate. This would be first seen with the Game Boy Color, which was just a Game Boy with color. It did okay. Like the NES to SNES, there wasn't too much of a big difference when it came to marketing, so many assumed it was just a Game Boy with color and nothing more. And then the Neo Geo Color came out, which was just a handheld Neo Geo, which already had color as it was a home console. The Neo Geo Color ended up failing due to cost-cutting measures on packaging, opting to use cardboard to ship overseas rather than plastic coverings, leading to thousands of handhelds to be damaged during transport. A moment of silence for the lost Neo Geo Colors. In 2001, and Nintendo was back with two big hits. I probably shouldn't say that. At the exact same time as the GameCube, which did okay, Nintendo released the Game Boy Advance. All it really added was shoulder buttons and better processing. It was also smaller. That's about it. The Game Boy Advance SP, don't ask me what the SP stands for, was just the same handheld, the Game Boy Advance, but it would now fold and it could be rechargeable, and I think it had a backlight, which a lot of handhelds didn't have at the time, so it was really hard to see the game if you weren't in proper lighting. But still, the Game Boy Advance SP used a folding design, which was pretty cool, and it's something we'll see later on down the line for Nintendo again. And the Game Boy Micro was just the Game Boy Advance, but small. It kind of feels like one of those bits where you joke around with a friend saying, oh, I bet you can't compact this thing super small, and then you do it just because why not? All of these handhelds did pretty well in their own regard. However, what they really suffered from was a lack of difference on a casual consumer basis, which is Nintendo's primary audience, of a difference between the new Game Boys and the older Game Boys. And the Game Boy Micro especially suffered from this. 2003 saw the release of Nokia's handheld. Moving on. 2004 had the release of the Nintendo DS, a completely new line of handhelds distinct from the Game Boys, using touchscreen and a larger two-screen display. This handheld was perfect for the everyday user. Not to mention, it released around the same time as the Wii, making both of these consoles extremely consumer-friendly, which really helped Nintendo. Later, the DS Lite would be released, which made the DS smaller and removed backwards compatibility with the Game Boy line. The DSi and DSi XL would make the DS larger and add additional cameras and storage drive slots. Because of these additions, some people began walking around with their DSs to take pictures since most phones lacked cameras. This includes me. For a good while, I'd bring my DS on every school field trip. Not to play games, just to take pictures.
As you've likely noticed, Nintendo had a very strong chokehold on the handheld market. If their consoles didn't do well that generation, their handhelds were sure to keep them afloat. However, there was a new competitor coming into the ring to properly challenge Nintendo. The PlayStation Portable.
PSP. It's like a nut you can play with outside.
I miss ads like these. The PSP, released in 2005, this was completely new. Handhelds had run-off cartridges for such an incredibly long time because adding discs would just make the handheld too big. But Sony found a perfect way around this, introducing Universal Media Discs, or UMDs. These discs were a bit smaller to the GameCube discs. However, they could easily hold a lot of data for games that were relatively small enough to fit on a portable handheld, like the PSP. Not to mention the massive screen available on the PSP and its compatibility with Wi-Fi, other PSPs, and of course, the PlayStation 3. With plenty of developer support, this handheld was almost perfect.
And you're not gonna believe what happens next. It did really well. 80 million units sold. Of course,
nowhere near the massive success of the DS. However, it did incredibly well for a very tightly controlled market by Nintendo. The PSP was amazing, and it was really great to see a different person other than Nintendo doing well in the handheld market. The success continued with the PSP Go, which was a smaller version of the PSP with a sliding controller and more space. However, the PSP Go wasn't really meant to last for very long. It mainly served as a cheaper option for those who still wanted a PSP and as a buffer while PlayStation continued to develop their next handheld. It did okay, which was expected. It was just a smaller version of an already existing handheld. And now Nintendo returns. After they struck gold with the Wii and DS, they knew what they had to do. Continue the line, because that has never once gone wrong in the slightest. They would continue the Wii and DS brand with the Wii U and the 3DS. And I'm sure you can guess what happened. Nintendo just didn't learn. The SNES didn't perform well because there was lack of marketing difference between it and the NES. The Game Boys didn't do their best because there was a lack of marketing difference between the new Game Boy and the original Game Boy. The Wii U didn't do well for the exact same reason, and the 3DS was no exception. You have to keep in mind, Nintendo's main consumers are casual consumers, buying these consoles and handhelds mostly for their kids and grandkids. Ask your grandma if she knows the difference between a DS and the new 3DS XL. Or the Wii to Wii U. The 3DS was released in 2011 and featured the ability to move a slider that would turn the graphics from 2D, like normal, to 3D. It was also backwards compatible with the DS, and it was pretty cool, all things considered. But with a lackluster release, not many major titles, and the lack of difference between it and the original DS, it just didn't do very well at all. What didn't help was how many versions of the 3DS there were. At almost every major holiday, a new 3DS would be released. These being, in no particular order, the 3DS, 3DS XL, 3DS LL, 2DS, new 2DS XL, new 3DS XL. 6 different models, with practically no changes in terms of hardware. Mix that with some really bad marketing, and you have a major loss, which definitely wasn't what Nintendo wanted at the time. What I find the funniest is the 3DS cartridges have this little lip that keep you from playing them on previous DS's. And the lip serves absolutely no function aside from that. It doesn't have any extra hardware space, it's just there to be a nuisance, and I find that incredibly funny. Now, with all this said, the 3DS wasn't awful. It did pretty well. It had a pretty neat gimmick, but just like the Wii U, the marketing was ultimately its downfall. But with Nintendo at their lowest, it was now the perfect time for PlayStation to step in with their new handheld. A phone. The Xperia Play. Sony's very own smartphone. Yes, this is a real thing and it did not do well. But Sony had the real handheld next. The PlayStation Vita, released in 2012 with a much better processor, more storage, a touchscreen, better graphics, partial backwards compatibility with the PSP, Bluetooth, and so much more. But something was missing. The PSP's party trick. Handheld disc gaming. The Vita had gone back to using cartridges. I might be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure the Vita's main way to get games was through the PlayStation Store. That would explain why they had extra processing and the lack of disk drive for complete backwards compatibility with PSP games that weren't available on PlayStation Store. This might have actually been the first attempt to make a fully digital gaming system, not to mention its remote play usability with the PS4. It would later be revised into the PS Vita Slim, which would decrease the size a little bit and replace the OLED screen with a cheaper LCD. It did pretty well overall, and it really didn't hit big with anyone and was just kinda okay. Still, it was a great improvement to the PSP. However, since then, PlayStation hasn't really gone back to handhelds in a pretty good while, but it'd still be really nice to see PlayStation go back into the handheld market with something that works fully with the PS5. However, there was a company that didn't know how to quit after losing so badly. Nintendo. Nintendo was back, baby! To kick off the 9th generation, the Nintendo Switch was released in 2017. Only 5 years after the release of the Wii U. Most Nintendo's fans, such as myself, were pretty worried about the Switch and what it could entail. The idea behind it was extremely experimental, choosing to combine both console and handheld aspects. The console became known as a hybrid console, with detachable controllers made for multiplayer and a dock to put the console into high performance mode and cast it to a TV. This had never really been done before, and it was an incredibly innovative idea. The ads and the marketing for the system and its games also held up the console, generating plenty of pre-release hype. The Switch was shaping up to be an incredible release. And that's exactly what we got in March of 2017. The release of the Nintendo Switch was phenomenal. Most stores quickly sold out on the first day, and Nintendo kept their console with a decently low price of $299. Within less than a year, the Switch had completely outsold the Wii U in units, not to mention the amazing exclusives on the console: Breath of the Wild, Mario Odyssey, Splatoon 2, Smash Ultimate, and many more. And this only increased as time went on. Later models would have a fully handheld version, the Nintendo Switch Lite, which was smaller and lacked the detachable Joy-Cons the base Switch had, and also didn't have any docking ability. However, it was fully handheld. There was also the OLED model, which just made the console larger, added a few quality of life features, and a better OLED screen. Since then, we've also gotten plenty of leaks and rumors of a Nintendo Switch 2. In fact, I'm actually recording this the day before Nintendo's Summer Direct, so maybe it's going to be announced then. However, I don't think a Switch 2 is going to do very well. Nintendo's still incredibly consumer friendly. That can easily be seen in 2020 with the high influx of people buying Animal Crossing and Nintendo Switches in 2020 because everyone's stuck at home and the pandemic and all that stuff. Just making a Nintendo Switch 2 or anything that has the words Nintendo and Switch in it just seems like it's bound to be a disaster, just like with the Wii and Wii U. It's likely that something like the Switch 2 is going to fail if it doesn't change too much, especially the marketing. It's, like I said just before, it's going to be the Wii to Wii U, the DS to 3DS, the Game Boy to the other Game Boys, the NES to SNES. It's all going to happen again. And it really sucks that Nintendo just doesn't learn from this. I do think whatever is being made is bound to be pretty good and at least be cool. All I hope is that it's at least more powerful than the current Nintendo Switch. And finally, we've reached the most recent handheld, the Steam Deck. Made by Valve, the developers behind the PC gaming store Steam, the Steam Deck was an all-new handheld that intended to be a fully portable and small PC. While the similarities with the Switch are obvious, the Steam Deck still stands fully on its own and can do more than just play games since it's a literal computer. Unfortunately, they're a little pricey, but it's still a cool step into PC handhelds that Sony or Nintendo could adopt later on. So there you have it, the full history of handhelds and consoles. I really hope you've enjoyed this series, and if this is the first video you've seen in this series going over the history of video games and consoles, I highly suggest you check out the other videos. There will be a playlist down in the description if you want to just binge all the episodes and get caught up with the history of video games, if that's something that interests you. Regardless, thank you all for watching this video, and if you've watched the rest of the series, thank you so much for your support. I really hope you enjoyed it. I'm Seb, and have a great rest of your week. Bye! This video is sponsored by me. I have a Instagram page, if anyone wants to follow and, I sometimes post like video updates and life updates, so if you want to see, what I'm up to or what I'm working on, go follow me there. It will be the probably first link in the description if you want to check it out. Thank you.